You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Chinese President Xi Jinping is visiting the neighbors. 5 days, 3 Southeast Asian nations, one goal: selling Beijing as a reliable partner amid the trade tumult generated by the Trump administration. A dizzying volley of U.S. tariffs has pummeled China, and China has hit back. Now, both sides are imposing double-digit and sometimes triple-digit percentage duties on each other's products. This is what China's Ministry of Commerce had to say last week.
If the United States wants to talk, our door is open. However, dialogue must be conducted on an equal footing and on the basis of mutual respect. But if they insist on pursuing a tariff war, China will respond in kind and fight till the end. Pressure, threats, or blackmail are not the right way to deal with China.
I'm Teresa Tang. This week, CNA's Olivia Siong joins me to break down China's strategy and discuss how receptive nations may be to President Xi's outreach. Hi, Olivia.
Hi, Teresa. Hi from Hanoi.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. I know you're trailing President Xi. You're speaking to me from Vietnam.
That's right.
Just before a flight to Cambodia. Can we start at the beginning? You know, when China announced this trio of stops, how was it billed? Why are these 3 countries geopolitically important to Beijing and worthy of Mr. Xi's first overseas trip of 2025?
Well, we had heard the possibility of President Xi visiting Southeast Asia for some time. I mean, put aside the US tariffs that you were talking about, China is ASEAN's largest trading partner, and we're talking about $800 billion worth of trade. And individually, too, China is the biggest trading partner for Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia. And China's foreign ministry did say that this trip bears major importance for China's relations with the 3 countries bilaterally, but also for ASEAN as a whole, calling these countries good neighbors, friends, and partners. Don't forget also that China and Vietnam are marking 75 years of diplomatic ties. Malaysia is the ASEAN chair this year. China also has been Cambodia's largest foreign investor in recent years. So that is the context, but the other context are those sweeping US tariffs, and timing is everything, right? Such big trips typically take months of planning, and it's not something that would have happened last minute. But having said that, it's coming at a crucial moment for China and President Xi. The context here, you mentioned China slapped with 145% duties for its goods sent to the US, Vietnam 46% duties, Cambodia 49% duties. And these are the highest duties that the US has levied on its Asian trading partners, and Malaysia 24% duties as well. And just shortly after this escalation in the trade war between China and the US, we saw President Xi hold this rare meeting, this central conference on work related to neighboring countries. It sounds very jargony, but essentially President Xi saying that China will continue to enhance its mutual understanding and trust with its neighbors. And that's important given the context of all that's happening with the US as well.
Yeah, President Xi, he's warned that protectionism leads nowhere, that a trade war would have no winners. And he made those comments in an article actually published in a major Vietnamese newspaper on the day he arrived in Hanoi. Olivia, how will Mr. Xi bring this message across to the leaders that he meets?
So Mr. Xi is meeting the top leaders of each of the countries that he is visiting. When President Xi sat down with the Vietnamese party chief Do Lam, he reportedly called on China and Vietnam to, quote, jointly oppose unilateral bullying and to maintain the stability of the global free trading system and industrial and supply chains. And that pretty much has been in line with China's messaging to other trading partners prior to this trip, whether it's with the European Union, with Indonesia, with Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Australia. The question is how it's being received by these trading partners. We saw Australia directly turn down China's appeal to join hands, even though we have to note that on this trip in Vietnam, the US or the Trump administration wasn't explicitly mentioned, but we know that the language that has been used is consistent to refer to the US and these sweeping tariffs, at least implicitly. After all, also, China is looking to alternative markets. It exported $450 billion in goods to the US last year, and economists are already revising their forecast for China's growth downwards for this year. So besides this message, people say talk is talk, but China also coming in wanting to present practical deals. In Vietnam, the two sides signed 45 agreements in areas like connectivity, artificial intelligence, trade of agricultural products, Vietnam talking about science and technology for cooperation. So China really wanting to present itself as a reliable partner, a constructive partner with economic opportunities for these countries versus the US. President Xi also trying to project himself as this global statesman. China talking also about how, interestingly, China with Vietnam and Malaysia being key influential forces in the global south. And so we see China really trying to up its ante on the diplomatic front, trying to shore up its ties with these countries.
I understand that. Here's the thing, though. There are unresolved disputes between China and some of these ASEAN members, namely territorial claims in the South China Sea. Given that, how likely will countries reassess their economic alignments and possibly pivot closer to Beijing? We know Vietnam and Cambodia are currently negotiating with the Trump administration.
Interestingly, at the end of President Xi's trip, as he headed off to Malaysia, I was sitting down with some local journalists here, and we were saying that actually it was interesting that this time the long-standing disputes didn't really feature that much in the discussions or in the joint statements that we saw. There was a mention in the final joint statement saying that China and Vietnam have agreed to properly manage and resolve their differences on maritime issues and to jointly safeguard peace and stability in the disputed South China Sea. These issues don't go away. But at the same time, though, given what's happening on the trade front, analysts are also saying that, even though there is a greater need for these countries to cooperate in light of those very heavy tariffs from the US, it's unlikely that these countries will actually do a full pivot to China, so to speak. We have to note also that, in the joint statement by China and Vietnam, it said that the two countries have vowed to jointly oppose hegemonism and power politics, as well as all forms of unilateralism. Now, that would seem like, given the context, it may be targeting the US. But I spoke to an expert at the IC's Yusof Ishak Institute, Dr. Nguyen Kiang, who is a visiting fellow there. And he said that, there may be pressure from China to make a very strong statement about the recent disruption, he said, by the Trump administration. But also there is some resistance from Hanoi to have any sort of very strong, harsh language against the Trump administration.
Most of those statements are about the continuity of cooperation between Vietnam and China, and maybe some enhanced cooperation in some areas, including infrastructure projects, but not actually any big substantial progress are made in the statements. And from a Vietnamese perspective, there are some areas of the statement, especially on trade. We obviously see the increasing trade deficit between Vietnam and China, which caused the suspicion from the US that Vietnam serves as a rerouting hub for Chinese goods.
So this joint statement is more of a compromised language. It is language that is consistent with the bilateral statements that we have seen being put out before by Vietnam and China. And the reason that Vietnam and ASEAN in general would be very careful to balance its relationship between those two superpowers, we just have to look at the stats, right? US is ASEAN's second largest trading partner behind China. Individually, the US is also a major export market for Vietnam. Exports to the US accounted for about 30% of its total exports. For Cambodia, those exports made up about 40% of its export value. So for these countries, balancing its relationship would be extremely important. You also mentioned that Vietnam is negotiating with the US, but China on this side would also want to make sure that its interests are not being compromised in exchange for some sort of reprieve from the US tariffs. And speaking to Ms. Huang Ti-ha from the IC's Yusof Ishak Institute as well, she helps us paint the picture of why this is so tricky.
They are under very high pressure to take visible steps to decouple from China, which is quite an unthinkable proposition, both economically and politically, especially in the near term. And at the same time, Beijing remains the only country refusing to back down. And so it may view the efforts of these Southeast Asian countries to negotiate with Washington as capitulation. And this will likely hurt Chinese economic interests significantly as well. It reminds me of a classic damned if you do and damned if you don't dilemma.
So yes, we heard there, ASEAN probably finding itself in a bit of, as they say, stuck between a rock and a hard place. It has always prized itself as being able to be neutral and balance powers. But we also did hear Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim acknowledge that it could become increasingly difficult for ASEAN to maintain strict neutrality given this an intensifying global power rivalry. So as a bloc, ASEAN has talked about engaging in frank and constructive dialogue with the US to address trade-related concerns, also pledging not to impose retaliatory measures in response to the US tariffs. So all these ASEAN countries will be having to walk this tightrope, so to speak.
Are there any downsides to President Xi's charm offensive? Because I know analysts have said this tour is not really typical of the leader's playbook, that his visits are usually highly scripted, they're symbolic, and they're not about deals per se.
Well, there's nothing really for President Xi to lose, right? He's going out there and he's trying to win friends. And as we heard from the other analysts, they're trying to position China as a stable, predictable partner with a huge market. But what is clear from the Trump administration's latest moves, it has a 90-day pause on most of its other trading partners when it comes to the implementation of these tariffs, all except China. Mm-hmm. And so analysts are saying it's pretty clear that the US is targeting China in this ongoing trade war. And so that leaves all these other countries in its crossfires. I spoke to the American Chamber of Commerce in Cambodia, and they did say that President Xi's visit at this time would possibly be not very good optics for Cambodia, given that it's also trying to negotiate with the US for some reprieve on those very bruising tariffs, because we're already seeing businesses saying that they are going to be severely affected and factories in Cambodia potentially having to shut if these tariffs do go through. And that results in loss of jobs and income for many people. And so they are doing all they can to try and get some sort of concessions. But on the other hand, with President Xi's visits, we have seen already this reaction from the US. President Trump saying that Mr. Xi's trip to Vietnam is probably intended to, quote, screw the US. So potentially what we could be seeing is this rivalry between China and the US just becoming all the more stark. And we spoke to Derek Scissors, who is the chief economist of the China Beige Book, and here's how he explained it.
All of President Trump's political eggs are in the China basket. If he just gives up on China without a win, he has nothing but disruption to show. So he has an incentive to stay the course. On China's side, they obviously don't like being singled out. They don't like the way they've been treated in terms of American words, in addition to the actions. So they have an incentive to stay the course. Both sides say they want a deal, but it's clear they want the other side to take the first step. If we don't get a deal, the U.S. will win. The U.S. is less dependent on China than China is on the U.S. There are more substitute suppliers than China. They're not as good as China in many cases, but they exist. There is no replacement for the American consumer market. So an all-out trade conflict between the U.S. and China, the U.S. is going to win. Both sides want to avoid that because, in a sense, both sides will lose. China will just lose more.
How far, then, is this going to go? President Xi says he's not afraid. President Trump says they will get a deal done.
We're resetting the table, and I'm sure that we'll be able to get along very well. I have great respect for President Xi. He's been, in a true sense, he's been a friend of mine for a long period of time, and I think that we'll end up working out something that's very good for both countries.
President Trump there talking about potentially making a deal. The question is whether both sides will actually sit down, given how things are so tense right now. China responding to those extremely high tariffs on its goods. We know that Chinese officials have used this term, 奉陪到底, which means that they will fight to the end. It's often used in martial arts flicks. It's essentially kind of like, if you want to fight, we will give you one. And that, essentially is being seen by observers as a change in tact by China, in the past being more measured, but at this point, it is saying that these tariffs have, quote, become a joke, and that if the US continues to play the tariff numbers game, China is going to ignore it, because effectively what has happened, given that these duties are so high, is that trade is already going to be affected. It doesn't matter anymore whether it's 84%, 125%, 1000%, trade is effectively disrupted. But experts are also saying that even though there may be a pause in the escalation of tariffs, because that doesn't really matter anymore, it doesn't mean that this is a de-escalation in tensions. In fact, now we should turn our attention to other non-tariff measures that are at play. We're talking about a fight in the financial markets, the stock markets, incredibly reactive to all that is happening. We're also looking at China putting export controls on critical minerals. And so at the same time, even as China has said that it will fight to the end, there's still a huge amount of trade. Like, the US is still an important market for China. And it actually has not closed the door on talks. It has left the door open. It said that it is willing to talk with the US despite what is happening, despite its calls for it to cancel these reciprocal tariffs. But China's grounds for talks to happen are that it must happen on an equal footing and on a principle of mutual respect. And what some observers are saying is that at some point, given the moves that the two countries are hitting each other with, it is going to hurt economically. Both sides are going to bleed. The question is, who can withstand the pain more? And that might drive them to the negotiating table. And depending on the state of the economy, it could also affect how those negotiations play out.
Yeah, in that clip of President Trump we heard a moment ago, he calls President Xi a friend, though we have heard some government leaders say friends don't treat friends this way. Before we wrap this up, Olivia, I want to ask you, how much more of Mr. Xi's travels are we going to see this year? You know, this three-nation tour, it's one of the largest he's undertaken in years. How vigorously are outreach efforts going to continue, do you think?
Well, besides this Southeast Asia tour, reports have suggested that President Xi may also be visiting Moscow in May to attend the Victory Day parade. EU leaders are also said to be planning a summit in Beijing in July. So diplomatic activity, we can be certain, will continue. But the question also is what happens with the US? I think what we will all be looking out for is whether there'll be some sort of lower level discussions on how to get out of this, what looks like a stalemate between China and the US. And the issue here is that it's so unpredictable for businesses, for consumers. What happens next? It's very hard to predict right now, but China generally expected to continue its outreach to its trading partners, continue its push as it continues to talk up its role in the global south and presenting itself as different to the US under the Trump administration.
All right, you've got a flight to catch, Olivia. Thank you so much for helping us make sense of China's move amidst this trade war.
Thanks for having me. I'll see you soon.
Lots of great content from Olivia, who has been covering tariff developments from the get-go. Just head over to YouTube and CNA.Asia for all of her reports. And also, there are TV episodes of CNA Correspondent every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time. I'm Teresa Tang. Thank you very much for joining me this week. The team behind this episode is Saya Win, Clara Ong, Tiffany Ang, Junaini Johari, and Craig Dale. Bye for now.